Hey there, Pastor Mark here. It's our prayer that this message would encourage and equip you in your relationship with Jesus. We're able to provide this content due to the joyful generosity of our financial partners. And if you'd be willing to join that tribe and help get some sermons like this around the world, you can donate at harvestbaptist.info/give. God bless. I have long said that Harvest is the most eclectic church that I've ever been a part of. And by eclectic, I mean people that have come into our church from all kinds of different church backgrounds. And I wanted to do a poll of the audience. If you have one of these churches or denominations as maybe your church background, then just shoot your hand up and we're gonna see kind of where everybody came from this morning. How many of you would say, I have a Catholic church background, grew up Catholic? Where's Catholics at? Okay, big chunk. How about probably a few less here, any Episcopal background? You grew up Episcopal? Okay, there's a smattering. How about Presbyterian? Presbyterians in the room? There's always quite a few. Pennsylvania's a pretty Presbyterian-centric state. What about Lutheran? Lutheran background? Where are my Lutheran backgrounds at? Okay, a couple here and there. Let's go Methodist background. Okay, a lot of Methodist background. How about Brethren background? Okay, handful of Brethren. Baptist background. How many Baptist background? There's a bigger chunk of this service than the first service with Baptist background. How about Pentecostal background? Okay, handful there. Non-denominational. Okay, we got a bunch of hands. Am I leaving someone out? Who am I leaving out? Yell it out to me if I am. No one. Who did I miss? Church of Christ. Mormon. We'll throw them all in. Anyone else want in? I get this question a lot as a pastor. Okay, pastor, I'm coming from a non-denominational background or a Presbyterian background or a Catholic background. You know, what's the difference? What are the difference between all these kind of groups and divisions and denominations and those sorts of things? And there are some subtle differences, to be sure. There are some very overt differences, to be sure. But the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at the structure of the church, biblically and practically. And I think it'll be very enlightening. We're going to highlight some spots where there's some agreeable differences between different groups. There's some spots where there really aren't agreeable differences, and we have to draw some lines in the sand. And we're going to look at like the thing we're a part of right now, the church. What is that supposed to look like? How is that supposed to function? What are we supposed to be on about? And I pray that it will be not just enlightening, but even inspiring as to what the church can and should be and what we should be striving for together. And I want us to get hungry for this. I want us to desire this and to see, well, when God says that or describes it that way, man, may that be true of us. May we work towards that end, and may we put in the effort that's required. So I want us to read just briefly 4 verses together in Ephesians 2 that talks about the church and kind of some basic structure of what the church would be. So here's Ephesians 2. Look at verse number 19. First part of Ephesians 2 is really about your individual salvation and how God works in your life on an individual level. But the back part of the chapter starts to explain more of the corporate level. And here's what he says. Now therefore ye, you Christians, you're no more strangers and foreigners, but you're fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. You are now part of a heavenly citizenship. You are now part of God's family. Remarkable metaphors. Then he goes on to use the metaphor of a building in verse number 20. You are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together grows unto a holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. Now there's a lot contained in these 4 verses, but I just want to observe a few fundamental points. First, there's a foundation that's laid. The second is that there's a frame that's growing. Third is that there isn't any freestanding, and the fourth and last is that there's just a fantastic claim. So let's start with the foundation. We're told in verse number 20 that we, the church, are built upon a foundation, namely the apostles and prophets, and then Jesus Christ himself, who is the chief cornerstone. So our foundation is first and foremost comprised of Jesus. There is some foundational in the apostles and prophets, which we'll talk about in a moment. But because Jesus is the chief cornerstone, the apostles and prophets are only foundational to the extent that they would line up with Jesus. That's what being the chief cornerstone basically means. Every other building block in that foundation takes its cue from you. If you're the chief cornerstone, they have to line up with you. You don't line up with them. That's how it works. So when it says that Jesus is the chief cornerstone, it's saying not only does everything rest on Jesus, but everything has to line up with Jesus. And if you build a church on anything other than Jesus, you are on sand. You are not on a firm foundation. As a matter of fact, Paul would go so far as to say that you can't build a church on anything else. He would say in Corinthians that other foundation can no man lay, but that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. What he's saying is, build a church on something other than Jesus, you don't have a church anymore. You can't build a church on a foundation other than Jesus. You have to build it on Jesus. If you build it on your political leanings, or you build it on your socioeconomic background, or you build it on some program that you're really enthusiastic about, whatever you build it on, you can become a club, you can become some sort of gathering, but you're not a church anymore. If you build on something other than Jesus, you're just not a church, because the church is built on Jesus. Paul would say in Colossians that Jesus is the head of the church, the head of the body, who is the beginning. He's the firstborn from the dead, meaning he rose from the dead and we're going to rise too one day. And it goes on to say that in all things, Jesus has the preeminence. Not a place, not prominence, but preeminence. He is number one. So this is really foundational. I know that most of you would understand this. Hey, I'm part of a church. I know we're supposed to be built on Jesus. Okay, not a newsflash, Pastor. But this becomes very practical. It becomes very practical when you're looking for a church. Most of you are not. Most of you are a part of this church, but every Sunday there are people that are here that are doing the church investigation thing, right? I'm looking at this church and I'm looking at that church and I'm trying to find a place that fits for my family. And I would encourage you, if that's you, come to our Intro to Harvest class, begin to learn a little bit more about who we are and what we're on about and what's important to us. But I can tell you kind of the sum total of that class is like, we're on about Jesus. There are lots of things you can evaluate in a church, but number one, like literally number one, is are they on about Jesus? Are they built on Jesus? Are they singing about Jesus? Are they talking about Jesus? Are they proclaiming Jesus? Like, is the church about Jesus? Because he is supposed to have the preeminence. That's how church is supposed to work. And while you can come to a church and you can ask, is the pastor personable? Is the music my style? Are these people, do I seem like I would fit with them? And I get it, right? Are they too old? Are they too young? Are they too tacky? Are they too fashionable? Are they, whatever question you have about church. But all of those questions are deeply subservient to the number one question, which is the church on about Jesus? There's a foundation in the church that is first and foremost Jesus. Jesus is the head of the church. Jesus died for the church. Jesus established the church. Jesus will build the church. The church is his bride. Like, the church is about Jesus. The church is not some sort of sociological invention or phenomenon. The church is a divinely established institution that Jesus not only established and died for, but continues to build. And simply put, it's important for us to remember you can't love Jesus and not love the church. It's an impossibility. There was a kind of ancient church father in 250 AD, Cyprian, who said that if you have God as your father, you have the church as your mother. And he's basically right. You don't get one without the other. When you are born again, when you're a Christian, when you're saved, you are now part of a heavenly citizenship. Yeah, verse 19 said so. You are part of God's family and you're his child. Yes, but you are part of the church. It's essential for us to remember that the church is the bride of Jesus. I know a little something about that. I have a bride. Her name's Maggie. And if you told me, you know what, Pastor, you're the best. Love you. I mean, I think the world of you. But your wife, man, she's a piece of work. I don't really like her that much. Now, no one will ever say that to me because my wife is far kinder and considerate and a far more wonderful person than I am, truth be told. I don't know, she's made from better stock or something. But if you tried to tell me, I love you, but I can't stand your wife, we're going to have a problem. It doesn't work that way. You don't get to love me and just not love my wife and run her down or degrade her. It doesn't work that way. If you have a beef with her, you have a beef with me. We go together, right? You mess with my wife enough, like we're gonna have a deep problem. Like I'm gonna do prison ministry from the inside. Like it's gonna be hard. You can't love me and not love my wife. The same is true of the church. You can't love Jesus and not love his bride. You can't do that. It's an impossibility. And while I understand you can look at like the evangelical landscape and see all that happens and like all the churches out there, and you could be befuddled by some of it, you could be concerned about some of it, you could have some problems with some of it. So do I. But that is not an excuse or a hall pass to forsake church altogether or to constantly demean or degrade or be against the church. And I meet Christians who are basically like, I love Jesus and I want to be a spiritual person, but I don't really want anything to do with the church. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. The church is the bride of Jesus, and while we should want the best for the church, we should want to be able to point out faults and foibles and address those and become better. Absolutely, we do not run down the church. Because the church, when it's all said and done, it's not my church. And it's not your church. We're part of it, but it is the church of Jesus. He is the foundation. He is the chief cornerstone. So don't ever make the mistake of saying, well, I love God, I love Jesus, I'm just not that into the church. That's an unbiblical hatching of your imagination. It doesn't work that way. The church is built on Jesus. But it does say that the church is also built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Now that's interesting. Because you could read some verses and think that the foundation of the church was strictly Jesus at the end. This says that included in the foundation are the apostles and the prophets, verse number 20. Now, I do want to point out that the apostles and the prophets, they were foundational. They were not finishes, okay? They're not the roof. They're not the crown molding. But they were foundational. You say, in what way were they foundational? Well, you had prophets, both in the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah, the prophet Jeremiah, and you would kind of have a good, probably, picture of like, well, these were the spokesmen for God. God would give some sort of revelation to them and they could speak on his behalf to his people. But in the New Testament church, you do have a gift of prophecy that's mentioned in several places, but most predominantly in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, that was a gift for the early church to be part of the foundation, where there were those who would receive a word from the Lord and would speak on his behalf. You also had the apostles. The apostles are specifically people who had seen the risen Christ, who had been taught directly by Jesus, and they were vested with the authority to speak on behalf of Jesus. Now, as you can imagine, the apostles and the prophets both, but they were temporary for the church. They were foundational, but seeing the risen Christ and being taught by him directly, there was a shelf life on that. Nobody born in 200 AD had that as a criteria, but the apostles did. When Jesus leaves, he does not leave a manifesto. He does not write anything down. He takes his truth and he passes the baton verbally and orally to the apostles, and through his Spirit, the apostles now become part of the foundation of the church. So when we want to know, what did Jesus preach on? What was the Sermon on the Mount about? Well, there was this apostle by the name of Matthew who wrote it down for us. When we want to know, well, how's the church supposed to structure and what's it look like? Well, there was this apostle, this guy by the name of Paul, who wrote it down for us, and those writings serve as not only key, but foundational elements for the church. If you want to know, how should I think about suffering, or how should I think about generosity? Well, there were apostles named Peter and John who put that in writing for us and communicated the teachings of Jesus to the early church. And these apostles and prophets, while yes, there was a shelf life on their ministry and they were temporary and are no longer in existence, we are deeply grateful for the role that they played in establishing the foundation of the church. I want to reiterate the point that I just said, that they were temporary. So I'm not an apostle. None of our pastors are apostles. None of you are apostles. None of you saw the risen Christ physically and were taught by him. Okay, so that precludes you from being an apostle, and it precludes me. Even the apostle Paul was sure to say, I'm kind of late to the party here. I know that my seeing the risen Christ was a little bit different on the road to Damascus and not kind of the stereotypical way, and I'm kind of like last up here. He called it as one being born out of due time. But that's not any longer. Even the idea of there being a prophet. I've had more than a few people over the years tell me that they knew a prophet who I need to listen to who was like a modern prophet, or that they were a prophet and they had a prophecy for me. And I hate to say it this bluntly, but I'm always like, no thanks. You know, Mormonism is built on this idea that in the latter days, God's raised up a new prophet who's not really part of the foundation, but is later, he's like the roof or something, and his name's Joseph Smith, and he has this new revelation from the Lord, aka the Book of Mormon. And because he has this revelation from God, the scriptures in the Book of Mormon, they're equal with each other. That's built on an idea that there's still a gift of prophecy, and Joseph Smith was a prophet, so we need to listen to him. That's not what the scriptures teach. There were prophets and apostles that were foundational, but they're not the crown molding. They're not the finishes. I've had a few people tell me that they had just kind of a prophecy for me. I have a prophecy, something for you. And my question is always, hey, the prophecy you're going to give me, is it in the Bible? Because if it's in the Bible, I really don't need your prophecy. I got it. And if it's not in the Bible, I really don't want it. Like, I'm really cool with the scriptures serving as the authority for the church and for my life. I really don't need a word from you or whatever this supposedly is. I don't know if my social media knew the extent of my studies this week, but I got an article popped up to me that I thought, oh, that's interesting. It was about the prophetic minister for a church in Redding, California, which is very close to where I used to minister. My wife grew up in Northern California, and we spent 5 years at a church there, and about 45 minutes away is a really, really big church, a mega church, probably 10,000 people or so. And they have a prophet on staff who they recently had to part ways with because the way that prophecies generally went is he would find someone, it's a big church, you don't know a lot of people, you don't know their names, those sorts of things. So generally he would find someone and would be able to say 3-4 things about their life that were deeply detailed and like, how in the world will this guy know this? How would he know about my grandma who passed away from leukemia 2 years ago? How would he know this and how would he know that? And it would serve as kind of this foundation of like, well, he obviously must be getting something from God. He knows these details about my life. I better listen. And then a prophecy would be given. And come to find out years later that they discovered he was just scrolling through people's social media and literally like had the church discipline the guy and be like, sorry, that was all fake. He just like scoured your social media and found details about you and pointed them out. That was his gift of prophecy. I'm not surprised when I hear things like that. Because the idea of an apostolic ministry or a prophetic ministry is something that was temporary in nature, but deeply foundational for the church. While we're on the topic, let's say a word about popes. You say, what does it have to do with popes? Well, this actually has a lot to do with the Catholic Church's teaching on popes. Because there's another moment where Jesus is talking to an apostle, Peter, and he makes this statement to Peter. It's in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus says, "You're Peter, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church." So you're talking about an apostle. You're talking about building a church on a rock, something kind of seems foundational for the church. Are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about Peter as an apostle being foundational? There are two basic ways to look at this. One way would be what I would personally subscribe to and we would as a church, that Jesus is doing a word play. And he's saying, Peter, which means rock. You could call Peter Rocky, really, if you wanted to. Rocky, I'm gonna build my church on this rock. Is Jesus looking at Peter and saying, I'm gonna build the church on you? Or is Jesus saying, listen, you're rock, but I'm gonna build the church on me? And truthfully, with just this text alone, all you're gonna do is debate. You're not gonna exactly know. I believe that he's saying it's me, Jesus, but the Catholic Church's teaching is that the apostles were foundational, and this is a moment where Jesus says, Peter, you're like ultra foundational. You're like the chief of the apostles. The apostles are gonna be a foundation, but you're gonna be like the bedrock, like you're gonna be the stuff. I got a really special apostolic ministry for you. And as time goes on, church history says that Peter becomes a bishop in Rome. And because he was like the first among equals, he was the chief apostle, he then basically is the pope. He is the best apostle. And all of his successors, the bishop of Rome after him, and the one after that, and the one after that, then they too get handed the baton, and they're the chief of the apostles, and they're the pope. And that's the papacy. It's more or less from this. Now, it doesn't take very long for people to start to scrunch their eyebrows and their forehead and say, wait, time out. That doesn't say anything about Peter's successors. That doesn't say anything about Rome or that Rome's the best church. That doesn't say, you could argue that Jesus is saying, I'm gonna build the church on me. Like, how do you get the papacy from that? And this is where there's been a big division in churches, Catholic churches, and pretty much every other church. Whether you're Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Baptist, doesn't really matter. There's a big division, and that one is going to subscribe to the papacy, and that the Pope and the church are the ultimate authority, and that somehow Jesus vested them with that authority right there in Matthew, versus pretty much every other group of churches says, no, the scriptures are the ultimate authority. There's kind of two ways to look at it. The church is number one, they're the ultimate trump card, and the scriptures are under them. Or the scriptures are number one, they're the ultimate trump card, and the church is under the scriptures. We would see it very clearly as the scriptures are number one, and we are under the scriptures. If the scriptures don't teach it, then we can't say it with certainty. But if they do teach it, we follow it and we obey it. The point is that there's a foundation in the church, Jesus first and foremost. And to the extent that the apostles and prophets line up with the chief cornerstone, they too were foundational. And now, fast forward all these years, there's no longer apostles and prophets. We don't give a lot of press to this topic or discussion, and it can almost feel a little bit like a lecture or something in seminary. But it's important to note that there was a role of the apostles and prophets in serving in the structure and in the foundation of the church. One last note, and I'll move on from popes and apostles and foundations. The Reformation that happened in basically the 1500s, where there's a bunch of clergy, more or less, who begin to say, no, the papacy's not in the Bible. The church can't be number one. The scriptures have to be number one. And this division that happens inside of the Catholic Church, led by Martin Luther, was not only due to theology, but it was actually due to a building program. And I think that's of note because we're in the middle of a building program of every Christmas Eve, you may see on TV the Christmas-like candlelight service from the Catholic Church at St. Peter's Basilica. Anyone know what I'm talking about? You turn on TV and you see that, right? Well, St. Peter's Basilica was built in the 1500s. It's a monstrosity. I mean, it's amazing, it's ornate, but the cost to build it became so intense that the Catholic Church began to realize we don't have the money. Like, we're stuck with this massive building project and we can't fund it. So 2 things began to happen. One was the Pope began to increase taxes like monumentally. And number 2 is they began to sell indulgences, which was a fundraising scheme, is what it is, to be blunt. It's this idea that you can light a candle, or you can say a prayer, you can put some money in, and you can help your loved ones get out of purgatory faster, burn off their sins faster. But all of it was basically a ploy to get the money to build St. Peter's Basilica, which is an amazing ornate building. But many of the reformers had a beef with this. Luther went so far as to say, listen, you're the Pope, build whatever church building you want, I don't care, but you can't build it out of the blood and bones of the sheep. It was his way of saying, like, you're going about this all the wrong way, which I think is just a very practical lesson for any church, that you can actually overextend yourself financially so much that you create undue pressure on the church, and you can begin to do silly and even slimy things because of the financial pressure and burden that you're feeling. And it actually is the job of church leadership to make sure that there's wisdom around finances. Otherwise, you may end up with some really silly stuff that happens. But the point is that there's a foundation. Is there a foundation of popes? No, that's not in the Bible. But is there a foundation of Jesus first and foremost, and the apostles and prophets alongside of him? Yeah, absolutely. But it goes on to talk about you and me. This becomes more practical now. There's a frame that's growing. If you look at verse number 21, we're told there's this foundation that's Jesus, the apostles and prophets, but then in whom, in Jesus, all the building fitly framed together. It's put together so beautifully and so perfectly. Jesus knows what he's doing. He's a master builder. In whom all the building fitly framed together grows unto a holy temple in the Lord. Now, I just want to point out the verb. Jesus is putting this all together, and the church is growing. The church is on the move. That's an important note, because there are different sects of Christianity or churches who wanted to cry like church growth. And I understand sometimes what they're saying, because there are some churches that are so overly concerned about nickels and noses that they've just begun to count what is the offering, how many people come, and that's all that they're on about, and they cease to be on about Jesus. And that should not be. But that's not an excuse to say, you know what, us 4 no more. We're fine with 50 or 100, and you know what, whatever the excuse is, we don't want to be overly concerned about numbers. God's not growing the church in America. He's doing it in other places. Whatever it is, the church is meant to grow. It's meant to grow. The early church grew. The church today, it's supposed to grow. You know how I know this? Healthy things grow. That's what healthy things do. As a church and as a pastor, we're never concerned, like the primary is not, let's grow numbers. That's not the primary. But that is kind of a natural domino effect when you're concerned about people being healthy. As a church, by and large, we're concerned about evangelizing people who don't know Jesus and edifying people who do know Jesus. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. We want people who don't know Jesus to hear the gospel and to put their faith in Jesus, and we want those who already know Jesus to be built up and to grow and to learn the scriptures and to love each other and to challenge each other and to encourage each other. Like, we want you to grow in Jesus. And what I've learned is that if you'll be focused on that and what's best for the church, what's healthiest for the church will grow as a byproduct. Some years you'll grow a lot, some years you'll grow a little, but there'll be a natural growth that takes place in the life of a church if a church is healthy. That's a good thing. And I'm pointing that out because right now we're in a season of transition and growth as a church. We are going to build a new auditorium that's going to start happening here in just a matter of a few weeks. There's going to be a lot of disruption. You can bet your bottom dollar what's going to happen. That's going to bring interest. That's going to bring curiosity. That's going to bring what I as a pastor call the looky-loos. They're going to come, what's happening here? There's life here. It's not every day this church is building something or they're growing. And we're going to blink our eyes and there's going to be 1,000 people here every weekend before we know it. We're almost there now, and that'll happen quickly. But you know what that will necessitate as growth happens? It requires changes and transitions and structures. It's not comfortable. It's inconvenient. You mean I got to park way out there now? All of those things are a natural byproduct, but it's okay. The alternative of saying, oh, we don't need to grow, let's just keep it right here, let's just plateau, that's a bad alternative. The church is supposed to grow. And yes, there are pain points that come with that, truthfully. I'm pastorally, just to be completely bluntly honest with you, I'm experiencing those right now. As the church has grown and as just different family situations have come up and just the needs of my own family, I've realized over the last 12 months that how I do pastoral ministry is needing to change and evolve, and I haven't figured it all out yet, but there's this just natural evolution that is needing to take place for the church to continue to be healthy and grow. And I'm having to minister in different ways. I'm having to limit access sometimes. It's things that I don't like and I'm not comfortable with, but I don't just want to stick it in neutral and just not grow. That's a bad alternative. The church is put together by Jesus, and it's meant to put it in the King James, groweth. It's meant to grow. But notice that there isn't any freestanding. More to come on this in a future sermon here in about a month. We'll spend a whole sermon on community in the church, but I want you to observe these words. Verse 19 is the metaphor of citizenship together and shared responsibilities to each other. Verse 19 is a metaphor of a family, the household of God. But if you look in verse number 21, the building is fitly framed together. Verse 22, in whom you are also builded, here it is again, together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. What he's saying is, you are a part of the church. You're built together with other people. You are not a freestanding building. All of the building blocks come together to make a cohesive foundation or a framework, and it all fits together nicely. You're not all on your own. You don't get to go be a Lone Ranger Christian that just does it, your privatized relationship with Jesus with no connection to other Christians. No. You're built together. We are in Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. I think I knew that before I moved here, but I really didn't know what that meant. And I can remember early on Googling, like, why are we the Keystone State? And what I found out was that it's kind of an old moniker from when there were 13 original colonies or states, that there were 6 above us and 6 below us, and we were right in the middle of the 13. Just like a keystone is right in the middle of an archway. And a keystone is interesting. And I think most of you know what a keystone is, right? The stone in the middle of the archway that has like broad shoulders and a tiny waist. You know what I'm talking about? You put a keystone in with other stones, it'll bring cohesion, it'll bring structure. It has purpose and significance and meaning that's unbelievable. But you put a keystone off by itself, it can barely stand up. Like, it'll topple over. It's not meant to go be all by its lonesome. It's meant to fit with the whole. And in the same way, when Jesus saves you, he does something for you deeply personal, but you are not meant to be by yourself. You are meant to be in the community of saints. You are meant to be part of a church. You're meant to build your life into other people's lives, and they to you. And there's a very valid question just when you look at what the church is supposed to be structurally, is like, where are you built into other people's lives? Like, let that rattle around in there just for a minute. Where are you built into other Christians' lives? Or is it like you're taste testing church constantly? You're here, but you're not really here. It's not supposed to be that way. So, Pastor, you don't know my last experience. I went to church. I mean, I gave, I tithed, I served, I poured myself into those people, and I got burnt. It was a miserable experience when it was all said and done. I do not want to invalidate that. I understand that those things happen. They do. But having church hurt or being burnt by church, and your response to that being, so I'm going to keep the church at bay, I'm just going to taste test, and I'm not going to build myself into other people any longer. That's a terrible response. I understand there's some vulnerability, there's some risk, there's some time, there's some money, there's some effort that goes into building your life into other people's lives. I 100% get that, but it is worth the effort, even if there is a risk factor involved. I think C.S. Lewis was famous for saying, you basically have two choices. You can make your heart vulnerable to other people, or you can protect it, and in turn, it'll become very, very hard. As a church, you're supposed to build yourself in other people. I was so glad Colin mentioned groups today. Like, understand when we're talking about being in a group or going on a mission trip with other people or serving on a team or coming to an event and getting to know other Christians, like those things are important. They're beyond important. They're biblical. It's the church being the church. You're not supposed to be freestanding. But lastly, the last verse tells us there's this fantastic claim. I don't know that I would even really believe it if it wasn't here, like black ink on white paper. Verse 22 says, in whom you're also builded together. So there it is again, you're together. But to what end? Why? Why is Jesus establishing the church and being the cornerstone, and the apostles are doing all this work, and now we're building together, or we're putting our lives with each other? To what end? Well, there's a lot of answers to that, but one of them is to this end. For an habitation of God through the Spirit. Now, I don't know if you understand what that's saying, but that is crazy cool. We believe theologically in the omnipresence of God, that God is present everywhere. But we also believe that the Bible teaches that in some sort of special way, of which I can't fully describe or comprehend, but in a special way, there is a manifestation of God's presence in heaven. That his glory and his presence is there in a way that it isn't everywhere else. Like, he's there and there and there, but he's like really there in heaven. You say, could you put that in more theological terms? No, not really. That's the best I can do. What this is saying is that you could take that same sort of idea and understand that when the church comes together, it serves as the house of God or a habitation for God in the manifestation of his Spirit in a way that is special, in a way that is glorious, in a way that you cannot do on your own. Can you go walk with God on your own, read the scripture on your own, and have God speak to you, pray to God on your own? Yes. And should you? Yes. But that cannot produce the Spirit of God in your life like when the church gets together. There is a unique manifestation of the Spirit of God when the church is the church. And you don't want to diminish that. You don't want to ignore that. You would never want to downplay what that's saying. That's saying that there is something special about what we're doing right now. We were shaking hands earlier. I'm glad we have shaking hands time. And Terry mentioned to me, he had no idea I was going to say this today. He said, Pastor, the Spirit of God is in this place. I said, Terry, you took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what it says. The Spirit of God is supposed to be where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name. There am I in the midst of them. When you get together in group and you begin to challenge each other and read the scriptures together and try to unpack what it means, the Spirit of God is there in a special way. When you go on a mission trip together and you're with other believers serving and evangelizing, the Spirit of God is there in a special way. When we get together and we sing, the Spirit of God is here in a special way. That's the church. That's something that we didn't invent, we didn't think of, we couldn't make it happen if we tried. It's God doing God stuff in our midst. So understand, when we're talking about the church, we're talking about something special. Understand the structure and what we're supposed to be on about. We're supposed to be focused on Jesus. He is the foundation of the church. We're supposed to love the church. We're grateful for the apostles and the New Testament writings that serve as a backbone for our church. We want people to be added to our church. We want it to be a healthy place that's growing. We want to build our lives into other people, and we want to experience and know God because of it all. Now, that's not all that the church is, but that is in 4 verses. What the Apostle Paul says, you want to know about the church? I'll tell you about the church. There it is. It's glorious, it's beautiful, it's so unique and it's so precious. And we should hunger for it, we should want it. We should be enamored by it. We truly would, we truly should.